In this video, we're back to working on the truck known as... And in the first video, we found that Lucky had a broken valve spring. And what we're trying to do here is try to repair it without removing the cylinder head as per the customer request. We're also going to be trying to find out what exactly broke, as well as why it broke in the first place. Hey guys, Josh with the Update Channel, and today we are working on Lucky, the orange car hauler again. And who knows what else we'll be doing this week. We've got Trash Fire International in there. It's got some parts on that. Not sure if we'll get that in a video. Who knows? It's Monday morning, so we might get something else interesting in here to work on. But for now, we're going to pull the injector out of number one cylinder, and the customer wants to see if we can do any sort of diagnostics on that cylinder without actually pulling the cylinder head. Not sure how successful we'll be with that, but let's see what we can do. So we're back to basically exactly where we left off before. And you can see, if you're looking on the two valves on the left, the one farthest from us appears that the stem is sticking out farther than the one forward to us. And you can also see the spring, the outer spring, is broken on that one. And we noticed this while doing the overhead. If you haven't seen it, watch the previous video. It goes into it in more detail. But what we're going to need to do is pull the injector out because we need to put a bore scope in the cylinder. So we're going to need a 9/16 socket with an impact and an indexing pry bar. And these injectors, obviously we have the overhead off already, so it makes this easier. But to get the injector out, all you got to do is remove that one bolt. And injector hold down bolts, according to CAT, are not reusable. So you're going to want to get a new one of those, which is what we did here. But then all you have to do is, and these C15 injectors aren't too bad, you just get under the hold down bracket and pop them up. Pretty easy. Now there's fuel in the rail inside the head on these, so you're going to get some fuel out of the injector, as you can see, and it's going to go into the cylinder, and that will need to be evacuated before any tests are done. And you can see we're on TDC. If you look closely, directly in the center, you can see the very top of the piston there. Now to check the condition of the piston and the bore, we're going to need to rotate it down. So that's what we did. Move the engine away from top dead center. Now, this is not a super high def endoscope, borescope, whatever you want to call it, that I'm using here. It's the only one that I have access to, but it works good enough. And it's a little hard here since I'm recording it on a computer with a camera, but I messed around with this for probably about 20 minutes and didn't see any damage to the cylinder. Didn't see any damage to the piston itself. And what we're trying to find is if, without removing the cylinder head, which the customer did not want to remove the cylinder, and I completely understand that, although we did recommend that, because it gets quite expensive once you remove the cylinder head. And if there was a big indentation in the piston, that would mean that that valve had struck the piston, and it would have been a really good idea at that point to remove it. So didn't see any damage there. What we're going to do here is put air into the cylinder. Obviously the bore scope has been removed. And if the cylinder holds air, that's also a good indication that the cylinder is in good condition. Not only that, we don't have anything really bent or messed up with the valves themselves, because if your valve head was bent, it wouldn't hold pressure in the cylinder. So what we're doing is we're just pushing air, holding the nozzle down, and seeing if it holds air. Which it did, so passed both those tests. So now what we need to do is try to remove the valve springs. And we're going to go to our valve train tooling here. Yeah, I don't think a paint roller counts as a valve compressor or any sort of valve tooling. So unfortunately, now we did order the correct tool. It's going to be there the next day, but wanted to get this off, the valve spring that is, as fast as possible, basically, without any damage. So we kind of used this setup what we have here to get the keepers off. So what I did is I put the piston at top dead center. That way, when you push the valve down, it'll hit the piston, and you can compress the valve spring. Now, luckily, the outer valve spring is broken, and the inner valve spring is pretty weak. So if you can, using this not exactly factory setup, you can get the keepers out. That will allow you to remove the valve springs and inspect the valve stem. Remember, we're trying to find if we need to pull the cylinder head. Now, we did order the correct tool, as I just mentioned, but we didn't want to wait a couple days to try and get an answer for this customer. So hence what we're doing here. Now, I have removed valves before off cylinder heads, but it's always been with the head removed and on a bench with a C-clamp style valve spring compressor. The tool we'll be using from CAT is not that style. And this tool, obviously what I'm using here, which is a pry bar, and a sensor socket, is not from CAT either. So this part is called the rotocoil. It actually rotates to allow the spring to move around, not bind. And we're going to get our valve springs off here. And as you can see, the outer valve spring there is, well, we'll just say it's destroyed. This week's Destruction of the Week comes from Liam, and this is a Mercedes, and this is in Australia, and it came in for a coolant leak. Coolant leak was actually coming out of the head gasket area, though, so he pulled the cylinder head, but found this. Yeah, one of the liners was completely pretty much destroyed. It's cracked, vertical scoring, pretty bad find there. Pretty interesting engine, too. I've never seen one of those engines before. This is not a destruction. This is actually this is off of a newer school bus that we were working on, and has a JIC fitting for the transmission cooler lines. However, and this is going to make, it made me mad, it'll probably make a lot of other people mad. Look at the tip of the JIC portion. Yeah, it's got an O-ring on it. What is the point of a compression fitting if it still has a seal? Use an O-ring face fitting then. Don't use a JIC. Just found that irritating. Now, we're back to Lucky here, and you might say, well, what are you doing with a coolant here? Well, the customer wanted a coolant flush because they had mixed some coolant together, which, you know, it's fine. Car haulers are particularly hard to do that on. Now, I'd purchased this used about a month ago. This is a Milwaukee fluid transfer pump, and I have not used it yet. But I needed to use it to try and get the fluid out of the little bucket into the big bucket. So let's see how well it works here and how fast it moves fluid. And it's an M18, so it uses 18-volt batteries. It's a 6-amp one. Let's see how well it moves fluid. Holy crap. Yeah, that thing moves some fluid. Pretty glad I got that. I'll put an Amazon affiliate link if you're going to get one. I would recommend it. So this is our valve spring. This is the old one, obviously, the outer. And these are the keepers. And I've never seen this before. The keepers basically have two little retainer ridges or teeth, not sure what you want to call them, but the lower ones on both keepers were ripped off. So really only the upper or middle, if you want to call them, retainer teeth were holding this valve in place. Pretty scary. The valve itself, luckily for the customer, appears to be in great shape though. The ridges, everything looked to be good. It moved freely up and down. So this is the cat tooling. This is the proper tooling, and this is what comes in the kit. And it compresses all 4 valve springs at once. And we've got our new parts. These are all cat parts, and these parts are actually relatively inexpensive. I think the springs are only like $25 each. The keepers are inexpensive. It's kind of crazy when you think about these very expensive engines have very inexpensive components when it comes to the valve train. But so you can see the old keeper on the left, newers on the right, and you can see the newers have the extra ridge that were snapped off of the old ones. So we are ready to assemble our valve springs back onto this. Now, this is how this tool works. It uses the injector hold down to hold this all thread in place, which sticks in the injector bore. Our piston on this cylinder, which is number 1, is all the way on top dead center, and that's so the valves don't fall into the cylinder. Now, this is a valve seal. Going to be replacing that. No reason to reuse the old one, really. They're super inexpensive, and it would be foolish to reuse it, really. So that one's pretty easy. You just slide it over the valve stem there, and it just basically sits there. And then you have your inner and outer valve springs, and what the rotocoil, which is what allows the valves to not bind and rotate. And then all you do is have your keepers. Now, I have not, like I said, used this tool before. This is the inner valve spring, and it is weaker than the outer valve spring. Some engines don't use an inner and an outer. Some just use a single spring setup, but these cats use an inner and an outer, and luckily the inner spring on this job saved this engine. So this is the outer valve spring. Obviously this one is stronger than the inner, and that's the one that broke on the other one. So they're not directional or anything. Just place them wherever you want, and they're going to move over time, and not move as in like vertically or anything. All they're going to do is they can rotate in place. And this is what I said was the rotocoil, kind of a weird name, but it allows the valves and the valve springs to move slightly and gives them a basically friction-free upper mount. Now, which seems weird, is the keepers are the only things that hold the valve and the valve springs in. It's just those two ridges on the keepers. Now before you put the keepers in, obviously you have to compress these valve springs, which is where the tool comes in. Now, like I said, I have not used this tool before. I've seen it in literature, but never used it. And that's apparent here because I'm trying to install it, and you can't install it with the IVA mount bolt in the way, which I probably should have known that. So now we have the IVA mount bolt out of the way, and now we can actually use our tool. Now, like I said, this is going to compress all four at once. And it's a pretty inexpensive, neat tool. If you were, say, wanted to do all of your valve springs or all of your valve seals at once, not all, but all in one cylinder at once, it comes with this bearing, and that allows it to be pretty much friction-free. And I always lubricate all threads on any sort of pullers or any tooling with engine oil. And then it comes with a washer, and then really all you do is you just run this nut down. I'm going to use a ratchet, and it compresses all the valve springs on the cylinder. Now remember, like I said, the cylinder piston is on TDC. That's what's going to hold the valves from fully pushing down. If you use this tool and it was not on TDC, you would just be pushing the valves down, and it wouldn't actually move the spring without keeping the valves in place, and you wouldn't be able to get your keepers off. Now, while you have your keepers off, if the engine were to rotate, the valves could fall into the cylinder, and that would be a bad day. Now, just because we're only repairing one, I wanted to check all the other ones since we had a keeper failure, and verify that the keepers on all the other valves on this cylinder were in good condition. So that's what I'm doing here, and I did check them all, and they were all in good condition. You can see they still have the upper and lower retainer ridges. So what we're using here is not retaining compound, but it's basically an assembly grease. I use it for O-rings a lot, but it's very tacky, and we're going to use that to keep the keepers connected to our valves here so they don't fall off, because nothing holds them on really other than the rotor coil, but when you have the valve springs compressed, that's not doing its job. So if you put a little bit of grease, you could use Vaseline, probably a whole bunch of other stuff, but that's what I like. That's what I'm going to be using here. It's tacky enough that once they're on there, probably not going to move out of place. So did that on all of them. You can see I've got the keepers back on all of them, and really we're ready to decompress these valve springs and get this puppy back together. So we are fully assembled now. We can put the valve bridges back on, put the overhead, finish our overhead, and then it's pretty much ready to run. Remember, we weren't doing very many large repairs on this. We were doing the injector harnesses, running an overhead when we found that the valve springs broke in the previous video. So what we're doing here is just making sure nothing looks weird, doesn't feel weird. You should not be able to push them down by hand like it could previously. So let's get back to assembling this engine. And you can see here, this is just a close-up shot that, yeah, they pretty much all look the same now, which is not how they looked before. Now, obviously, you have to remove your all thread there before you put your injector in, but everything looked good. Now, we believe in good dental hygiene here at Western States Cat, folks. That's why we're going to use some cat engine oil here on our toothbrush. Obviously, I'm not brushing my teeth with this, folks. Don't do that. I've been experimenting a lot with different ways to apply oil to seals since can't really use oil-resistant gloves anymore. I've been using different things, and I found a toothbrush works really good. It holds a lot of oil, so it can help you apply a layer of oil cleanly to seals without getting any sort of dirt or bristles or anything on the seals themselves. Now you can see we've got our valve cover base back on. One thing I wanted to talk about is these injector clips. People have a lot of confusion with these. First thing, there's two things with them. They're numbered. So we're number 2 cylinder. Look at that, number 2. Each one will have the number of the cylinder it's supposed to be on. I've seen several people put those on incorrectly. Also, the orientation does not matter. You can flip it, depending on the slots, what works best for that solenoid. Does not matter. It does not have to match how it came off. So that's just some good information to know. So we got old Lucky running here, and it ran good. Customer's pretty happy with the repair. He's really happy that it didn't drop a valve, obviously. So I'd like to thank Martin for a PayPal donation this week at adeptape@yahoo.com. I'd like to also thank Mike. And I'd like to thank you all for watching and hopefully catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching.